We don't often talk about relationships with addiction, struggles with substance use, struggles with drinking, struggles like sobriety, sober curiosity. We don't often think about how systemic oppression, like racism, patriarchy, colonization, capitalism, ableism, fat phobia, anti-Blackness, colorism, how they inform our struggles with those substances. But my recovery journey revealed to me that that was a really critical and important thing to center as part of how I would recover from my relationship with those struggles with substances. And I think it could be a big impact for you too. Before we get into it, my name is Carolyn Collado, and welcome to Recovery for the Revolution, where we decondition, decolonize, and get ready for revolution together through recovery as a resistance practice. So, growing up, I had known that in my lineage, there was struggles around alcohol. I have a grandfather who he is passed now, he's an ancestor, but I didn't know him long in life. But one of the things that I did know about him is that he struggled with alcohol. You know, he drank a lot. And I was brought up because of that, being told to fear alcohol, like be careful with alcohol, that addiction runs in the family. And so be careful with that. But I am also first generation American to this country. I grew up in a predominantly white environment, and I am not white. I am Black, Indigenous. I am queer. I am non binary. I am two spirit. I am neurodivergent. I am a lot of things that would make me stick out in all of the predominantly white environments that I grew up in, came up in, worked in. And so, getting ready to go to college, I was like, I am absolutely not going to have a relationship with alcohol that would differ from the norm, right? When we think about college, we think about binge drinking. We think about people deeply drinking as part of the social norm of what is expected of exploring other substances too, right? Like weed is one of those big things that's also part of the college scene, as well as other substances that were happening around me in my wealthy peers, because I was getting ready to go to Yale University, which is, you know, one of the top universities in the globe. And, you know, where a lot of people who are the 1% of the planet send their children. So there was no way that I was going to have a relationship with alcohol that wasn't part of that American norm of binge drinking. I needed alcohol and wanted to explore alcohol to try to fit in, to try to make connections with folks who were so different from me and who I felt less than going into college and all throughout college. Because I was not skinny, I was not white, I was not rich. I, you know, didn't come up knowing the canon and, you know, all of this like white centered norms of knowing and knowledge. I was not bred to be upper class. That was not what my upbringing was. And so I drank. I drank to try to fit in. I drank to cope with and try to explore my queerness, to try to approach that coming from thousands, which were deeply homophobic times, right? Like calling someone gay was like a slur, it was an insult at the time. So trying to overcome my own internalized homophobia. I was raised Catholic. I went to Catholic school up until I got to Yale. And so trying to explore my sexuality, trying to initiate and have sexual experiences after being told my whole life, you know, sex is only for marriage and only between man and woman, trying to have pleasurable experiences. And again, feeling so deeply less than. There were so many times that I would return home to my dorm and cry because I felt so less than the skinny, rich, white, beautiful women that I was surrounded by. And I felt so less desirable, less worthy, less smart, right? Like taking certain classes and people like flexing just white centered ways of knowing and just feeling so much less than. So then I leave college, I moved to DC, I drank for a year in DC. DC has a really heavy drinking culture. And in January 2018, I get a realization that like things are not well and like I am struggling. So I start to enter 12-step spaces. I started with SLAA, Sex and Love, Addicts Anonymous, because again, there was so much of trying to initiate sexual experiences in hopes that that would placate and heal just how much less desirable I felt because of my race, my gender, my size. I am thick. For those of you who cannot see me, like I am thick when there was so much fat phobia growing up. So that also had a really big impact, as well as just internalized anti-Blackness and the feeling of being less than that goes so deep for me. So I started there. And then through those programs, I ended up in Alcoholics Anonymous. I have issues with Alcoholics Anonymous that I will get into on another episode. But I started there and I thought, I had always been grown up to know that my grandfather really struggled with alcohol. And, people talk about this being like a progressive disease. I have problems with thinking about this as a disease as well that I will get into. But this is progressive. It will only get worse as things go along. My grandfather drank for a long time, the majority of his life. So I thought, okay, I am in my early 20s. I should probably stop. And like I said, I didn't have an extensive relationship with my grandfather in this life. He died when I was young. But I felt like his intuitive presence when I started to get sober. And I just thought about him a lot. And when I experienced his intuitive presence, I felt guided. Like one of the clear guidances was to heal around our relationship to Rafael Trujillo. So, for those of you who don't know, Rafael Trujillo is like this notorious dictator from the Dominican Republic. He terrorized the country for several decades. He was backed by the United States because the United States is really vested in, it didn't want another Cuba. It had hold over Puerto Rico. And so the Dominican Republic maintaining itself as like a capitalist nation that could be controlled and influenced by the American government was really important. And Trujillo basically rehashed deep colonial wounds that were part of the Dominican Republic's history. So the so-called Dominican Republic, it is the earliest settled colony in the world. So, when we think about Christopher Columbus, I'm laughing because I'm thinking about Columbus Day is celebrated in the United States, but Columbus was our colonizer. Columbus colonized the Dominican Republic. The way that the Spanish colonized the Dominican Republic was to establish, and so many other Spanish colonized nations, right? If you come from another country that's been colonized by Spain, you probably resonate with this. They set up a system called the encomienda system, which is a system of racial hierarchy. And one where, so Spanish are at the top, Spanish born, and then Spanish mixed with indigenous mixed, right? Which really has horrifying implications, often SA, non-consensual relationships, right? So Spanish and indigenous, Spanish and Black mixed, and then Black at the bottom. And so they established this hierarchy and created this way of being that incentivizes those of us who are colonized by Spain to run away from our Blackness, to disavow, to shake off our Blackness. There's that meme on the internet that's like, I'm no Black, I'm Dominican. That's where that comes from. It is a deep history of Dominican colonization, Spanish colonization, being about shirking Blackness in order to get ahead, in order to be desirable, in order to have resource, right? Because colonization is so extractive of resource from all over the world. And so to get access to that, you must disavow your Blackness and disavow your indigeneity. Anything that takes you away from that white Spanish ideal is going to make you less than. But it's a hierarchy. So the closer that you get to it, the better. It is mejorando la raza, or bettering the race. So when my grandfather is telling me that I need to recover from Trujillo, like he was alive during the time of Trujillo. Like Trujillo was alive in, like he was ruling from like 1930s up until like the 1960s. So our grandparents' generation, great grandparents' generation, and our parents' generation, for some of us, were impacted by this regime, this fascism that centered anti-Blackness. He encouraged people to whiten the race, better the race. He enacted a mass unaliving of Haitian people, right? Because Haiti has long been a stronghold of Black liberation. Haiti liberated so many countries in the global south. Haiti helped contribute to liberation here in the US empire. Like Haitian liberatory fighters helped liberate the Dominican Republic, and they share the same island. They have different colonial histories, they have different colonizers. They were originally colonized by the French, so Haitian colonization story is slightly different in terms of its origins, but our destinies have always been intertwined. And so this dictator reinforced a regime of fascism around anti-Blackness. And so you have like that recent colonial wound that was like opened up again by this dictator, and the deep need to heal that, right? The deep need to heal that. So in Alcoholics Anonymous, they have the 12 steps, which are, steps for living, as they call it. But basically a process of recognizing what is your problem, like what is your struggle with alcohol, specifically Alcoholics Anonymous, but there are many 12-step programs that have come off of AA. What is your problem? Then there's a process of like processing resentments. What do you resent? Why do you resent these things? Sharing that with another person, and then getting ready through that process of transforming, of healing, so you are ready to take accountability. And then you have a process to continue to kind of see what's going on with you, see what are your motives behind things, and take accountability as needed and spread the message. That's kind of a summary of the 12 steps without naming all of the steps. So there's a step called the fourth step where you take a searching and fearless moral inventory. And, you are supposed to list all of your resentments. Basically, anything that you're kind of like, it makes you pissed, you're supposed to write it down. And I wrote down like 458 resentments, which is really unusual. It's not supposed to be that long, or at least that's not typically what the practice has been. But when I wrote all those things out, it was a deep recognition of all of the ways that I was hurting because of race, because of gender, because of sexuality, because of class, because of all of the ways that I was hurting myself and other people because of systemic oppression. I had a long history, because I grew up in predominantly white environments, of colluding with whiteness, of not standing in solidarity with other Black, Indigenous, and people of color, because I thought that my best survival strategy was to keep my head down and just survive the environment I was in, right? If it's going to be predominantly white, or if it's going to carry out white supremacy, it is safer to hide myself than to, stick out there and get punished, face violence because of resisting these systems of oppression. And that was a really big grief. There were so many people that I wrote down that, like, the grief was that I didn't get to have relationship with those people, or I wasn't in close, like, community with them because of my lack of solidarity, because I was afraid of whiteness or patriarchy judging me and punishing me for doing that. There were also so many resentments that pointed to suppressing my sexuality, wanting to be with those, like, cool queer and trans kids that I saw on campus, that I saw in high school, who were, like, living their lives. But again, I went to Catholic school, so there was also a lot of punishment. There was a trans student who was expelled from my high school for being trans. So there was just grief around that was meant to be felt, grief to be processed. And I was big mad at, like, all of those systems. Again, I grew up Catholic, so I was deeply resentful at the Catholic Church and all of the conditioning that I grew up that told me how to be, right? And that sex was wrong, that, being queer was wrong, that marriage was between man and woman. I just could not stand it. That self-pleasuring is a sin. I found that ridiculous when I learned that. Oh my God, how ridiculous, right? But the church is so deeply motivated by what will reproduce its people and how do you control people, that it is it has created this conditioning that so many of us grew up with, because also Catholicism is really deeply connected with ethnicity. And so many of us who were colonized by, Catholic church and its institutions inherited Catholicism growing up. So I was so mad at that. I was so mad about beauty norms and things that felt so harmful and made me feel so deeply less than. And spilling that all out on that page, I was able to give myself compassion, because as much as I had hurt myself, oh, it's tender to talk about. As much as I had hurt myself and others because of, like, colluding with these systems, I could also see that, like, these systems played a big role in making me feel like I had to do that. And so beginning the process of forgiving myself for that collusion, for that harm. And from that place, committing to liberation. Part of the 12-step process is making amends. And, one of the things that we do is, like, self amends and living amends. How do you live in a way that is different, and how do you make amends to yourself? And so recognizing how much harm I had caused to myself and others because of that, it has made me deeply, deeply commit to solidarity and mobilization against systemic oppression, and doing so in a way that is in deep community with those of us who are most impacted by these systems, right? It has also looked like stepping into myself more deeply. When I first started my recovery process, I really struggled to articulate myself. I would just shove my thoughts down because, again, I grew up in a predominantly white environment very young. And I learned that very early on about the fact that white folks can't really, or could not really, or were choosing not to hear the truth about racism, about, patriarchy or anything. That those thoughts and those experiences, the experiences that I have known from a very young age and that have been known intergenerationally in my lineage, are a threat. And so I had always been taught to shove that down. It became like a pathway. Like, I couldn't actually speak the truth. And on a daily basis, I was bracing myself. In the somatic healing, they talk about it as armoring, right? Like, my shoulders were so deeply tense. My jaw was so ever clenched because it was not safe to actually speak what I thought and navigate being in environments that centered whiteness and patriarchy and ableism and fatphobia and capitalism. and colonial norms. Yale is older than the United States, and Yale was a big part of the colonization that was carried out in this nation and in so many places. Some of the biggest slaveholders came out of Yale University, and Yale was funded by the slavery that was enacted in the Caribbean. So when I learned that, I was like, oh, what kind of like karmic retribution was this that I ended up in this place? So part of what recovering looked like was speaking up and was healing my body from these systems. Part of recovery was healing my body from these systems and speaking up. It's really magnificent and something that I could not have imagined 6, almost 7 years ago when I started this process, that I would be sharing the truth online to like, oh, who knows how many people will listen to this or watch this video on YouTube. Who knows? But it just was not possible. It was not possible or accessible to younger me. And that just feels so tender to say out loud. So, shout out to younger me who committed to healing themselves bit by bit, making themselves be seen, healing the thoughts of being less than or unworthy that so impacted my thinking, that so lived in my body, that made it feel like existing as myself was unsafe, and stepping towards bit by bit what it looked like to be free from these systems. And that is what my recovery journey has looked like and what it has been about. Stepping towards freeing myself, freeing my ancestors, and freeing collective through a deep commitment to collective liberation that has been informed by just how painful it has been to be impacted by these systems, to collude with these systems, and the ways only alcohol could help me cope with that. It's been hard because, again, I will talk more about my troubles with AA in a different episode. But AA does not, in its mainstream text, AA does not engage with how do we navigate systemic oppression. And that made me feel deeply hopeless, but also fuel the fire in me of like, I need to heal from this stuff so I can make sure nobody else has to feel this way. So that is the deep motivation for this channel, this podcast, for the work that I have been doing, Recovered for the Revolution, on Instagram and TikTok for 4 years. There is so much deep healing and recovery that we are being called to do from these systems. And when we are in that recovery process, it helps guide us in committing to fighting against them so we can stop these cycles of harm that we and our lineages have been living through for centuries. So, this is where we begin. This is the first episode. And this is hopefully what is to become a resource of support in fighting back these systems through our recovery. If you would like this podcast to continue, if you would like to see us bring in other beautiful folks who are like committed to collective liberation and can help support us in walking towards that, in being in that now, I invite you to support us at patreon.com/recovery for the revolution. Help make this podcast sustainable so we can continue this much needed resource. Capitalism also wants us to be isolated. So send this podcast to anyone that you think would really resonate with it. Have a conversation, build community around the discussion of what we are uncovering here together. So that way we can get free from these systems together, because we need each other if we're going to do that. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. And I'll see you in the next one.